January 14th, 1939. Warsaw, Poland. The air was thick with the scent of smoke. Not from fire. No, Warsaw hadn't burned yet. But the slow, suffocating choke of occupation. The Nazi forces had already crossed into Poland, their boots heavy on the streets, their flags draped like bloodstains over the faces of buildings. Yet in a modest house on Ulica Karmelika, there was no outward sign of the war that had taken root just outside her door. Inside, the floorboards were neatly swept, the fire in the hearth crackling softly, and a warm pot of soup bubbled away on the stove. There was nothing in this room to suggest that its keeper, a woman named Helena, would soon become one of the quietest but most dangerous rebels Warsaw had ever known. She wasn't a revolutionary by nature. Helena was a midwife, someone who had devoted her life to bringing life into the world, not taking it away. Her hands had always been steady, even as they delivered children into the chaos of a rapidly changing world. But the chaos outside her door was different now, more insidious, more relentless. The Nazis had come not with the fury of armies at first, but with quiet, creeping control. They had imposed curfews, restricted movement, closed down newspapers. They had begun with small things, stripping away the dignity of the people, but everyone knew what came after small things. It was only a matter of time before they would demand more. Helena had witnessed it all, her heart heavy with every passing day. The roundups, the brutal displays of power, the humiliations. As the months dragged on, her role as a midwife began to feel almost absurd, as though her very profession was an act of defiance against the growing weight of tyranny. In a city where so much was being erased, her hands, stained with the blood of birth, seemed to carry the weight of everything still human and pure. The contrast of those moments, when she would welcome a newborn into the world, against the backdrop of soldiers marching down her street, was not lost on her. She could feel, in the air, that something was coming. And it wasn't just the smell of oppression. It was the smell of resistance. But resistance wasn't something that would announce itself with cries or banners. In fact, it could look like something far more ordinary, like a midwife washing her hands, as she always had, before tending to the wounded, or the routine of a woman preparing a meal for her family, making sure no one noticed the secret pieces of paper hidden beneath the floorboards, or the way a mother's arms, once used to cradle her children, would now be used to cradle small packages wrapped in cloth, hidden weapons, resistance pamphlets, intelligence smuggled in under the noses of the occupiers. Helena was no soldier, no trained fighter, but in her, there was the same defiance, the same spirit of rebellion that had existed in the very heart of Warsaw for centuries. The first whispers had come tonight, carried by a friend who had somehow managed to avoid the eyes of the Gestapo. A man named Pavel, who had once been a neighbor, a simple street vendor, but now found himself tangled in a network of resistance fighters. His words were simple, but they burned with the intensity of 1,000 unsaid things. We need someone who knows the city, someone the Nazis won't notice, someone who can move freely. We need you, Helena. She had hesitated at first, unsure whether the very act of agreeing would plunge her deeper into danger than she had ever been. But the thought of doing nothing, of letting the weight of the world fall upon the shoulders of others while she stood by, was unbearable. So she agreed, and she began to smuggle things, papers, weapons, plans, through her house, hidden in the most unlikely places. Beneath the floorboards, under the loose bricks in the fireplace, in the space behind her kitchen cupboard. The old house, the one she had inherited from her mother, had long been full of secrets. But now it was a different kind of secret, a dangerous one. Each day felt like a new game of cat and mouse. Helena would tend to her regular clients, playing the role of the dutiful midwife. The babies would come, one by one, small miracles in a world that seemed to be falling apart. But beneath the routine, she would slip away for moments, just long enough to bury a new message or retrieve a new package. And with each passing day, she could feel the tension in the city growing. The SS had started to tighten their grip, making their rounds with increasing frequency. Rumors swirled about arrests and executions. In the midst of it all, Helena's home remained a sanctuary for the underground. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows grew long, a new visitor arrived at her doorstep. A young man, pale and thin, wearing the unmistakable look of someone who had been running for days. His name was Mikolai, and he had just come from the nearby ghetto. The desperation in his eyes was unmistakable. He had information, he said, crucial intelligence, the kind that could change the course of the war if it reached the right hands. But the Nazis had caught wind of it, and now he was being hunted. Helena's heart clenched. It was one thing to hide a package, to smuggle something small and easy to conceal. But a man? A living, breathing person, hunted by the very force that had already claimed so many lives? The weight of the choice pressed upon her. If she refused him, he would die. But if she accepted him, the risk would be even greater. She looked at Mikolai, his eyes wide with fear, and then at the floor where the boards were already weakened by years of age. She knew what she had to do. The midwife who once only tended to the living now had to make a choice, one that would determine whether she would become a part of something far larger than herself. She opened the floorboards and motioned for Mikolai to step down. He hesitated, as if he couldn't believe his good fortune, but then did as she instructed. And so, in the dark of that cold winter evening, a simple midwife became a silent guardian of a rebellion she could neither openly embrace nor abandon. She had no idea how far her actions would go, nor could she have known how quickly the walls would close in. But for now, she had done what she had to do. She had made a choice. And in the silence of her home, with nothing but the sound of the wind rattling the windows, she waited for the next step in the game that had already begun. Outside, the city was still silent, but soon, very soon, it would erupt. April 22nd, 1941. Warsaw, Poland. The war had changed everything, but it hadn't yet broken the city's spirit. Warsaw stood like a city on the edge, where each breath felt like a struggle between the old world and the new. The occupiers, with their high boots and cold eyes, had made their presence known with brutality, yet the heart of the city still beat. Resistance wasn't something one could speak of openly, but it was everywhere. In whispered conversations in crowded markets, in glances exchanged on street corners, in every hesitant step taken by those who dared to move against the tide. And in the midst of it all, Helena, the quiet midwife, continued her dangerous work. But now, it had become something more, a mission. It was no longer just about smuggling papers or weapons hidden beneath the floorboards. It was about more than survival. It was about defiance. The rebellion had grown, spreading outwards from the small circle of resistance fighters Helena had first met to something larger, something more structured. They called themselves the Home Army, and they had one goal: to resist, to fight, and to survive long enough to reclaim their city. Helena was no soldier, but as a midwife, she knew how to bring new life into the world. In this case, it was new life for a rebellion that had yet to fully bloom, struggling beneath the weight of an empire that seemed indestructible. Pavel had come to her once more, looking more ragged than before, his once-pressed uniform now stained with the grit of survival. The underground network had grown, but with the Gestapo's tightening grip, they needed someone who could move without drawing attention. Helena was that person, and she had learned, as only a woman in her position could, how to maneuver in a world where every move was dangerous, where every decision could mean the difference between life and death. She had become an unexpected leader in a war she never thought she would fight. She didn't carry a gun, nor did she wear a uniform. But she had something more potent than either of those things: knowledge of the city and a keen understanding of its rhythm. She knew how to slip through cracks in the walls, how to move with the ebb and flow of daily life, unnoticed. The Nazi officers, suspicious, hungry for any sign of rebellion, would never expect that the woman who helped deliver children, who cared for the sick and elderly, was also quietly helping to dismantle their hold on the city. But the more Helena worked, the more she understood the brutal paradox of the moment. It wasn't enough to outsmart the occupiers. Resistance wasn't just about hiding or smuggling. It was about outmaneuvering an entire army. It meant moving in plain sight, carrying messages hidden in bundles of laundry or beneath the layers of bread. It meant weaving through the streets with the weight of betrayal hanging in the air, because at any moment, a single word from the wrong person could send her to the torture chambers, and that would be the end of the fight. The Nazis had already taken the more prominent leaders of the resistance. They had their eyes on the networks, dissecting them, picking apart every tiny thread. But the small, unnoticed voices, they didn't see them. And that was where Helena and her network came in. The resistance wasn't just being run by the brave men who wore uniforms or held rifles. It was the housewives, the shopkeepers, the midwives, the children, people who could move unnoticed through the cracks, who could carry weapons hidden in bundles of vegetables, who could slip away from the Gestapo at the corner of a street and disappear. One afternoon, Helena sat with a woman named Zofia, a friend she had known since childhood. Zofia, though quiet by nature, had become one of Helena's most trusted allies. Zofia worked in a nearby hospital, and it was through her that Helena had been introduced to others who had become part of the network. Zofia's hands were rough from working long hours, but there was an elegance to the way she held a needle, a grace in the way she moved between patients. She had the same quiet strength as Helena, the same resolve to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. "We're running out of time," Zofia said, her voice low, her eyes darting around the room, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "They know something is happening. They're watching hospitals, the workers, anyone who could be connected." Helena nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. She had heard similar reports, soldiers watching the delivery rooms, observing the midwives, listening for any signs of insurrection. There was nothing about the war that wasn't risky, but now it felt as though every breath she took was a ticking clock, counting down to something neither she nor anyone else could fully understand. It wasn't just the Gestapo they had to worry about. There were collaborators too, Poles who had betrayed their own people for a few scraps of power, a few promises of safety. These were the faces that moved like shadows, invisible but always there, always watching. It was a war not only against the Nazis, but also against the people who had chosen to work with them. The traitors were everywhere, and there was no one Helena could trust entirely. On the next mission, Helena led a small group of fighters into the heart of Warsaw. They were on their way to smuggle a package, plans for a sabotage operation, to another group stationed in the east. The journey was perilous. Every corner they turned, every alley they passed, was filled with the possibility of death. It wasn't just the Nazis they feared, it was the traitors too. They couldn't be sure if anyone in the crowd was working for the other side. One wrong move, one glance in the wrong direction, and everything could unravel. The group moved quickly, their steps measured, every gesture controlled. They couldn't afford to make a sound. The streets felt colder than usual, as though even the buildings were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. As they approached the meeting point, a woman from the underground passed them a briefcase, its contents vital for the coming operation. But as they turned to leave, a sudden commotion erupted behind them. A man shouted, his voice rising above the others. He was pointing directly at Helena's group. Panic set in instantly. The resistance fighters scattered into the nearest alleyways, but Helena froze, her feet locked in place. For a split second, she thought of running. But then she remembered the world had already moved past running. The war was no longer something that could be outrun. It had found her, and it would find everyone who dared defy it. In that moment, time seemed to stretch. The world around her narrowed. She knew she had one chance, and if she hesitated, if she faltered, it was over. With every ounce of courage she had, she turned and faced the oncoming soldiers, her hands clasped in front of her, as if in prayer. She wasn't a fighter. She wasn't an assassin. But she was something more. She was the bridge between the past and the future, the woman who would help decide which side of history Warsaw would land on. The soldiers approached, their boots thundering on the cobblestones. For a moment, Helena stood still, staring them down, as though daring them to come closer. But when the first man reached her, his face stern and cold, she made the smallest, subtlest of movements, a signal. And as if on cue, a dozen resistance fighters appeared from every direction, their rifles raised, their voices demanding the soldiers drop their weapons. For the first time, it wasn't just a quiet rebellion. It was a confrontation. It was a message. We are here, and we will not disappear. July 3rd, 1943. Warsaw, Poland. The city had changed. The past few years, each one heavier than the last, had left scars on the streets, on the people, on the very air itself. Warsaw was no longer just a city in the heart of Europe. It was a battleground, a place where hope clung to life like a flickering candle, waiting to be extinguished. The Nazis had tightened their hold, and the Jewish ghetto had become a prison, its walls lined with the hollow eyes of those who had once been free. Yet, even here, amid the brutality and despair, the resistance had not faltered. They had adapted, evolved, and fought back. But the cost had been immeasurable. Helena had known what she was risking. From the moment she'd begun her work with the underground, from the first time she'd hidden a weapon beneath the floorboards, she had understood the stakes. But it was never about her own safety. It was about something larger, something she could barely name, an idea, a belief that even in the darkest hours, there was a place for defiance, a place for life. That belief had carried her through the endless nights of fear and the dangerous walks through the city's shadowed streets. It had carried her as she smuggled people, weapons, and information past the Nazi guards, each mission a step closer to the edge. And yet, now, with the walls of the ghetto closing in, with the Gestapo's presence growing more oppressive by the day, Helena couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away. She had seen her friends taken, her fellow fighters arrested, some executed publicly in a brutal display of power. It was as if the resistance was fading, disappearing like smoke, just as they had begun to make a real difference. The Nazis, with their endless resources, had methods for crushing uprisings, and they were using them all. Fear had become a weapon in itself. The day the Warsaw Uprising began, it felt inevitable. The tension had been building for months, the whispered conversations among the resistance growing louder, the plans more urgent. Helena had always known this day would come, but when it did, it came with a force that was almost too much to bear. The streets, once alive with the sound of people moving in their daily routines, were now filled with gunfire, with screams, with the roar of explosions. The city had erupted into chaos, and there was no turning back. Helena was no soldier. She had never worn a uniform, never carried a weapon in public, never taken part in the bloodier aspects of the war. But when the uprising began, she understood her role immediately. The resistance fighters needed her now more than ever, not just to carry messages or smuggle goods, but to help those who were caught in the crossfire, to tend to the wounded, to provide shelter where there was none. Her home, once a quiet sanctuary, became a hospital, a refuge, a place where the injured were brought in and out of hiding as quickly as she could manage. It was a grim sort of survival, each moment filled with the stench of blood, with the sound of heavy boots on cobblestones. The fighting raged for weeks, and it became clear that the home army, despite their bravery, was outmatched. They had no artillery, no heavy weapons, no support from outside the city. They were fighting a war with nothing but sheer will, using makeshift weapons and a determination that could only come from the belief that they had nothing left to lose. The Germans, on the other hand, had tanks, planes, and the unrelenting might of their war machine. Each day, the streets grew quieter, the gunfire fading into the background, replaced by the deep, hollow silence of a city on the brink of collapse.